Welcome to another episode of Let Go and Lead, where we discuss the new realities of leadership with pioneers, provocateurs, and passionate leadership champions. Today I'm joined by Niven Postma from South Africa. Niven is a Harvard Business Review contributor and author of the book, If You Don't Do Politics, Politics Will Do You. It's a definitive book on understanding and successfully navigating office politics. Niven's insights on leadership and the impact of office politics provide great examples, pragmatic advice, and ultimately a wonderful sense of optimism. This was such a fun chat. So let's get comfortable and get ready to let go and lead. So Niven, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to talk to you because I've been so impressed with your work on organizational politics. And your book is so interesting. If you don't do politics, politics will do you. I thought that was a great title.
Thanks. I thought so too.
I know you really got to the point of writing the book based on some of your own career experience. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, Maril, I was totally allergic to the concept of politics my entire career. And I had a successful career. My first executive position was when I was 29. And I always say to people, there were so many things that I learned, so many things I was taught in my career, in management development programs, in my degrees, in the books that I read. But gosh, the one thing that I had to learn, and sometimes learn the hard way, was all around this politics stuff. Reflecting on a lunch I had today with an ex-colleague of mine, I said, as wonderful as my career was, as enriching and rewarding as it was, the times I really hit a brick wall was never around my technical skills. I had those. It was around the relational, the political skills. And how much easier some of those really difficult experiences would have been if I had been a little bit less allergic to a concept that I actually didn't understand.
It's interesting because a lot of executive recruiters will talk about the difference of people moving from the number 2 role to the number 1 role is often just their ability to really work the room, to work across the C-suite, like various phrases that we use that I think really is what you're referring to when you talk about office politics.
Absolutely. And I often talk about, I've met so many people in my career, hands up high, people, including myself, who are guilty of this idea of what I call a butt problem. And it's not a BUTT problem. But when I talk about a butt problem, I talk about you have the technical skills, but you don't have the relational skills. You have the, in inverted commas, right answer, but you don't have the right coalition of support. Because that's part of what my PhD is about as well, is this idea that we tend to think that so many things in organizations are rational and analytical and everyone just applies their best objective strategic thinking. Well, yes, part of that is true, but the other huge part of that is relational and political. And so what I always say to people is, look, you can absolutely choose to ignore this stuff for the rest of your career, no matter what I say, no matter what I write, and no matter what I've learned. But understand that you're taking a risk, and in my opinion, you're making a bit of a mistake. Because the reality is that there's always 2 organizations, 2 teams, 2 departments. The formal one, and that's the organogram where you're the second in command, the delegations of authority, the KPIs, all the stuff that is the strictly seen and observed governance stuff. But there's an entirely other and allied organization, team, and department, and that's the informal one.
Right.
And that's not written down anywhere. And that's about how things work in relationships and who's got whose ear and who's looking out for who. Not necessarily in Machiavellian and toxic ways. Of course, it can be that, but it doesn't have to be that. And so if you choose to only focus on what you think is strictly your job and the formal side, well, fine. But then you're essentially, it's like you're making the choice to play tennis on half the court, soccer on half the field, because that formal and that informal, they're as important and they're certainly as real.
A lot of the aspects of culture of how things get done around here.
Oh,
And being
absolutely.
able to really work it. This just made me think of the Japanese concept of nemawashi, which means tending or working around the roots. And
Yeah.
it comes from the concept of transplanting trees, but it's so ingrained in their culture in terms of how all decisions are made, where things are always done before the meeting. Small groups are brought in so they feel empowered, both executives and people further down the chain, so that by the time a decision's made, everybody feels they made it.
Mm.
And that makes me wonder, do you see a big difference from country to country in terms of how office politics plays out?
When I was lecturing to a group of women in Abu Dhabi, and I was supposed to be in Abu Dhabi to give this lecture in person. They were all bankers. It was Ramadan, so they were all wearing hijabs. I couldn't eat on the call, not that I would have, but I couldn't even sip a glass of water. And I was astonished. Out of all the people I have ever lectured to at all levels of organizations, these women were the most skilled that I've ever come across. I mean, it felt like we were having a conversation between peers rather than I was the stage on the stage or the stage on the screen, as the case was. And we didn't have time to get into it. I only had about 4 hours with them. But gosh, I was struck at how much stuff they knew intuitively. And I wondered what that was about, what it was about the culture that they navigated, the culture that they experienced, that made them so smart about how to work in this informal space. And they spent zero time complaining and whining about the fact that they had to. They just accepted it as a given and they got on with it. Whereas I think a lot of other audiences, particularly Western audiences, spend a lot of time in the normative space of what should be. And I mean, yes, let's get a good bottle of wine and let's talk about what should be and what could be in the world. But somewhere between what could be and what should be, and being this raging idealist, and on the other extreme, being a completely burnt out, disengaged cynic, well, somewhere in the middle is a degree of pragmatism that I think is a bit more helpful. And gosh, these women struck me as completely pragmatic and very skilled.
In thinking about the journey, what are some of the elements do you feel that really influenced your development as a leader?
I think a number of things. And I was speaking to somebody the other day, and they looked at my CV and they said, "Help me make sense of this." Because I spent 4 years backpacking after high school. I had the equivalent of $100 and a rucksack full of clothes, and I was 17, and I came back 4 years later. Then I started working as a strategy consultant at a very high end consulting firm. Then I was the CEO of two large not for profits. Then I was at the central bank, and then I was head of leadership and culture for the largest bank by assets in Africa. And so they were trying to make sense of this. And I said, look, on the surface, I'm sure it's difficult to connect the dots. But under the surface, it's always been about working with people to do something that matters. And, that can sound unbelievably trite, or it can be quite powerful and fundamental and visceral. What do I do? Who do I do it with? And how does it leave anyone and anything better off? And so I've always said I've never had a job, but I've always had work. I think a job is something that's just about moving things from an inbox to an outbox and hoping you get enough at the end of this month to pay all the bills. Yes, of course, that's part of it. But for me, work is bigger. Work is about that meaning and contribution and community and purpose and identity that's way beyond just the job title. And so I think I've always had that strong sense of, you know, um, what's this world I've ended up in and how do I make it better? And so I've been in leadership positions, funnily enough, since I was 11. This idea of caring enough to ask some questions of myself and of the world around me and to work with people to answer them in a way that is inspiring for all of us. I mean, I flipping love that. And so I've always had opportunities to do that.
And how, as you really went through this journey, did you really come to the realization that office politics was where you wanted to spend your time and make a difference?
Oh, that's easy. I got fired. No, I'm serious. I did. No, it was dressed up as a retrenchment. It was very elegantly, very graciously done, but also very ruthlessly. And look, I don't necessarily blame the person who made the decision for making it because I was getting increasingly frustrated where I was. But it's that exact point that we were talking about earlier that I'd just gotten the most fabulous performance evaluation, a fat bonus. It wasn't the technical side, it was the fact that I had done a number of things on the political side that weren't standing me in great stead. So I had alienated someone that I subsequently realized was the chief whisperer. And I didn't realize, I still don't know if that phrase, the chief whisperer, is something I came up with or somebody mentioned it. I've Googled, I don't know where it comes from. So it might
Yeah.
be one of my original thoughts, who knows? But I had made the mistake of thinking I had more of a mandate than I did, that I had more leverage and power than I did. And I had a huge mandate and I had a lot of power and I had a lot of support and a lot of backing. And like I said, this great performance evaluation. But I had overplayed my hand a little bit. And, I can rationalize it and I can defend it and I can justify it. And there's a long story behind it and a lot of people who say, that was really unfair what was done to you. But that is essentially what it boiled down to. I misread the situation. I wasn't invested enough to be careful. And actually, getting out of there was one of the best things that could have happened. But what was less great was the fact that it was somebody else's decision and not mine, because I'm
Hmm.
used to leaving on a high. I leave before people want me to go. Everyone's in floods of tears. No, stay, stay. And I'm like, sorry, you got to go. More mountains to conquer. And this time somebody else made the decision. That was not a great feeling, not a great feeling at all. And it led to a lot of introspection around, okay, so now what? What do I do with the rest of my career? What do I want to be doing for the next 20 or 30 or 40 years? And really reached the realization I don't want to be an employee again. I've loved all my roles. But right now, what I want and what I want for the next few decades is autonomy and variety. I'm not going to get that as an employee. So I want to set myself up, back myself. And one of the things that I think is really worth thinking about is this office politics. And then lo and behold, a very good friend of mine who runs a very successful women's leadership development program spoke to me and said, look, I'm wanting somebody to develop a module, a day-long module on navigating office politics. And had she come to me a few weeks before, I would have said, oh, no, no, thanks, but no thanks. And then, funny
Yeah.
how the world works. Suddenly I'm like, well, what do you know? I've got some free time on my hand, a big fat retrenchment package,
Yeah.
and an opportunity to rethink and reinvent myself yet again. And so that's what I did. I spent 2 months reading and researching as much on the topic as I possibly could, really getting to understand something that, as I think I've made clear, I really didn't understand. And then put together the workshop, and from there, it's just grown legs.
That's terrific. In your story makes me think of how many people are brought in as change agents in organizations and then they're expelled because the antibodies like drive them out. Like Francesca Gino from the Harvard Business School, she wrote a book on rebel talent and all about really what it takes to be a rebel talent. And I've just known so many incredible change agents who just didn't make it
Yeah.
because the organization just couldn't really respond. For the very reasons they hired them, they fired them.
I've just started reading about it in my PhD. There is something that's fascinating called the initiative paradox, where you want your people to have initiative and to take initiative, but then the moment that they do, you're like, yes, but not that initiative and not in that way. And, and I sometimes wonder about leadership. Yes, we want people to be leaders. We want them to push the boundaries of what's possible. We want them to be courageous. If I have to hear the word courageous leadership one more time. But then when they do that, okay, but not that kind of courageous leadership and not right now. And yes, we want you to give honest feedback, but not to us. We're not the problem. And we need you to tell everyone else that they're the problem. I mean, we could have a long conversation about just that, I'm sure.
And that really interests me because, as you know, this whole subject around this podcast is around how do you let go and lead? And it's really around ceding control.
Yes.
And I know you've had some really interesting thoughts on this too. I've seen that you've talked about the difference, which I love, the difference between control and controls. Can you just share with us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it came when I was working at an organization that's incredibly strict around the manufacturing elements of what it does and zero margin for error. And there was also a whole bunch of frustration and entropy in the organization around the culture. And we used the Barrett Culture Survey so people could choose their own personal values, the organizational value, and then the desired, or the organizational culture, and then the desired values and culture. And there was such a mismatch. I mean, it's the first time that I've actually seen the complete opposite of synergy, because where people put their own values was actually higher than where they put the organizational values. So I thought, gosh, so we are literally seeing a case where the whole is less than the sum of the parts. Gosh, this takes some thinking about. But one of the words that came up very strongly in the experienced culture that a lot of people were pushing back on was control. Control, control, control. And in conversation, there were huge gaps between older and younger employees in the South African context, black and white employees. And I could see that particularly the older white employees were getting very frustrated with the fact that this word control was coming up. And they were saying, but do these people, these youngsters, these new people, not understand the nature of the operations that we are running here? We're not Google. We're not an internet startup. We're not an advertising agency where we can just make it up as we go along. And we kept having clashes around this conversation and around this word, which became a huge sticking point. And then it suddenly just dawned on me, hold on, we're using the same word, but we're not talking about the same thing. And I
Right.
said, no, 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 no. Guys, there's a fundamental difference between controls. You're dealing with zero margin for error with a huge manufacturing operation that's mission critical to the country. Those controls are there, they're necessary, and thank heavens for them. But that is not the same as control. And this feeling like I've got a jackboot on my throat and I can't breathe. And that you bring me in to think, and then the moment I think, you tell me to be quiet. And essentially, what we've got in this organization is the most prevalent culture of learned helplessness, because you're so busy thinking for people, controlling people, that eventually they give up and they stop thinking. And then you're tearing your hair out as managers and leaders and saying, are we the only people in this place that think? And so you've got this vicious cycle going round and round and round. But people have opted out of thinking because whatever they say, whatever they do, you're not listening. And so how amazing, this concept is, and how amazing semantics are, that we can use the same word and mean very different things, or we can use very different words and mean exactly the same thing. And to get to the heart of what's going on here, to the heart of people's frustrations, so that you can actually connect, that we want the same thing. We're not asking for something ridiculous. Gosh, that was very powerful when we could make that happen. But yeah, the difference between controls and control, I think, is a critical one.
And it's really a great example because so many industries have that challenge, right? The financial services, insurance, airlines, places where they're just high stakes that you've got
Yes,
to get it right.
yes.
So, how as a leader do you balance those controls while loosening control of your people?
I mean, I think it's a lifelong juggling act. And I think there's probably a few answers. There's a fabulous article that came out in the Harvard Business Review called Why Should Anyone Be Led by You? Which is an extraordinarily powerful question to be asked and ask of yourself. And I was in my late 30s, maybe even early 40s before I read that article. So here I had been in leadership positions for decades and never thought to ask that question. And they talk about in that article the quality that really brilliant leaders have of tough empathy. So you care deeply about the results and you care about the people. And I mean, everybody will say that, but when push comes to shove, how many times we regress to the results? And I am forever grateful that I headed up this NGO in my early 30s, working with orphaned and vulnerable kids, about 30,000 kids, height of the HIV/AIDS crisis. And I had to learn that at a very profound level, this compassion and accountability, because here I was working with child-headed households, 15-year-olds who are raising their siblings in appalling circumstances. I'm working with grandmothers who've lost all of their kids and are having to raise their grandchildren on government grants. And you can't not have compassion for those people. I mean, there's something fundamentally wrong with you as a human being, never mind a leader, if you can't see what they're up against. And I couldn't only have compassion, because then I was essentially running, a support group. And I was trying to run a multi-million rand
Mhm.
organization with donors who wanted answers and delivery and results. And so what this article spoke about in terms of tough empathy, I realized, it's compassionate accountability. You have to have both. And I think it ultimately boils down to trust. As much trust in yourself as trust in people. And it astonishes me how many people don't trust others because they don't actually trust themselves. And when you trust people, you trust three things. You trust their competence. So, do they know what they're doing, or could they figure it out if they
Right.
don't yet? Do you trust their character? Do you trust their caring? They're caring about what they're doing, they're caring about you, they're caring about their stakeholders. And I think if you trust yourself enough to trust your judgment, to trust your ability to support people and deal with the consequences if you get it wrong, then you can trust other people and you can deal with the consequences and manage the exception when and if it happens rather than managing by exception and these blanket rules of thou shalt and this, like I experienced, learned helplessness that just sets in as a result. Well, either learned helplessness or people just leave.
And where do you see the concept of mutuality and trust? I'm asking the question because a lot of the research I've seen has shown that if you feel you have mutual goals, it increases trust. And if you don't have that and you don't have the other things you mentioned, the competence and caring, etc., that's what leads to like a balance of power issue. So that's when people start putting in trust safeguards, like contracts and unions.
Yes.
What do you think of that?
I mean, I think that's exactly the point, right? Is there's so
Yeah.
much work that's been done on the employee compact and this idea that there's mutual commitment and reciprocal obligations. We're all so obsessed generally with the employee obligations, but there are mutual obligations and commitments here. And I was speaking to a group of leaders the other day, and I just found it fascinating, this idea that we need to think about the employees. And I thought, gosh, the last time I checked, yes, you guys are all senior, and you might have salaries that are multiples of this of the employees, and you have share options, but you're still employees. This false
Right.
distinction between us and them. We're the leaders, and we must understand what they're
Yes.
thinking. You probably have a personnel number as well, and you get paid every month. That makes you an employee, buddy. Last time I checked, and so I think understanding that when you're interviewing people, they're interviewing you as much as you are them. And I shared a story the other, and I mean, that's just an example, but this understanding of mutuality and that what are we wanting from each other? What are we needing from each other? What are we offering each other? Not just this one way jumping through hoops to impress people. And the onus is normally on an interviewee or an employee. I put up a post on LinkedIn actually the other day. I got so much response about a friend of mine who's interviewing for a very senior position, an executive position. All of the normal stuff around salary and bonus options and share options and all of that. I mean, yes, of course they're on the table because they can't not be given her level of seniority. But for her, they're really just hygiene factors because anywhere she goes is going to offer her that or a variation of that. And so the question that she was asking herself as the deciding question between which role that she was going to take was, do I want to become like these people? Yeah. Do I want to become like these people? And if the answer is no, well, then run for the hills. And if the answer is yes, well, then we are in this together. How do I shape this organization and contribute to it? But similarly, how am I going to be shaped by it? There is that we're in this together mutuality that I think we
Mhm.
often lose sight of because, well, the employees are those faceless numbers out there and they're interchangeable. No, they're not. This is a multiple of efforts and discretionary energies from the top to the bottom and all the way through.
No, that's so true. And the other concept that always makes me laugh is when everyone talks about the company. And I'm like, well, who do
Oh,
you think
yes.
the company is? It's, it's not the building, it's not the logo. We're the company.
Exactly. No, exactly. It's hilarious. And my favorite always as well is when people talk in such a way that leadership always seems to be the level above them. I mean, you talk to managers, no, it's the senior managers. You talk to the senior managers,
Right.
no, it's the executives. You talk to the executives, no, it's the exco. You talk to exco, it's the CEO. And eventually, who's actually running this place, people?
Yeah, that's funny. Going back to the office politics issue, I'm curious, have you seen much of a difference in gender? And one reason I asked that is, it triggered that thought when you were talking about work doesn't represent itself, or you need to really make sure that people know the kind of work you do and the great job, and all the research around how women seem to be more reticent to really promote themselves in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's two things that I often bring up in lectures or workshops that often strikes a chord with women-only audiences. The first one is a quote from Sally Krawcheck, which I read years ago and
Mhm.
filed in the recesses of my memory and then called out when I was developing this course. And it was an article that she wrote on LinkedIn, and the name of the article pretty much says it all. And it's called The Single Biggest Mistake I've Seen Women Make at Work. And she goes on to say that that single biggest mistake is that all too often, so many women treat work like school. So we think if we put our head down and we work really hard and just do a great job, somebody's going to notice and they're going to give us an A. And gosh, I remember when I read that, how it struck me. And of course, it's not only true of women and it's not true of all women, but it is true enough of enough women that every time I say it, you can see women taking notice and thinking, yeah, I get that. And I suppose that's part of the trade off, right? Of girls and women generally in most countries, not all, graduating in higher numbers from schools with higher marks, and then that continues through to universities. And so the recipe that served you for most of your life into your early 20s, maybe even your late 20s, now suddenly changes at work and nobody tells you. Simply putting your head down and waiting for the A's is not how things work at work. But like I say, those rule changes are never explained. I think the second thing comes from Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, where she speaks about the distinction that she experienced in her career. I've certainly seen it in mine. I don't know the degree to which you've seen it in yours, where how many women wait until they're perfectly ready and they've got all the answers before they take on a challenge. Now, I mean, that's impossible. And I've seen that play out twice. Once, when I was the CEO of the Businesswomen's Association, we had a very prestigious award. It had been going since 1980 for the Businesswoman of the Year in the country, and real luminaries in the country had won it. When I was the CEO, I had to phone the nominees and let them know that they'd been nominated. And I was new to the role, so this was the first time I was doing it. And the first one or two phone calls, I thought, gosh, this is going to be a bit harder than I thought, because I'm phoning these women whose names I know from the business papers, and I'm telling them about this nomination, and none of them want to accept it because they're all telling me, "Oh, that's lovely, but no, 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 I'm not quite ready yet." No, that's really, really nice, but I'm sure there's someone else more deserving. So eventually, I thought, well, look, I'm not going to keep having the same conversation because it's getting a bit tedious. So the
No, you
third
should take it.
yeah, well,
Okay.
the third phone call I had ended up being the woman who won that year. But that was where I changed my script. So I phoned and I did the whole spiel, and I got the whole spiel back from her. And I thought, I'm not accepting this. And I said, no, look, I hear what you're saying, but two things. First of all, this is not a lifetime achievement award. Okay, so I'm sure you're going to do many other things, but for now, you're considered worthy enough of being nominated. And the second thing is that there's a lot of research that says girls need to have role models. People need to have role models that look like them to feel that there are possibilities in the world for people like them. So you might not feel that you deserve it, but you actually owe it to girls and young women to take on this nomination so that we have role models for them to look up to. Well, blow me down if she didn't. Oh, well, okay, well, then I'll take the nomination. I thought, this is hilarious. Tell a woman that she's done a wonderful job. And she, no, 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 no. Guilt trip her into saying, you have to take this nomination because you owe it to other people. Oh, well, no, that I'm much more comfortable with. It's just so funny.
That is a great story. I know one of the things you've talked about are the 4 building blocks of political success. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
As I've understood this subject a little bit more, have distilled, the need for political intelligence being as important as your IQ, your EQ, all your other intelligences, and that the political intelligence or lack of it then leads to your political capital, or similarly lack of it. And really, when you're getting politically smart, you're getting intentional, you're getting deliberate around 4 things: around your relationships, the strategic relationships that you invest time in and that you nurture, around your power, so the formal power that you have, but also around your influence, which is the informal power that you have and that you can extend. And then lastly, your reputation. What are you known for? What do people think of you? What's the brand called you? To use Tom Peters' phrase from 1998. And so the degree to which you understand that these are the building blocks that are multi-directional and either reinforce each other or not are really, really critical things for you to get your head around. And so, particularly going back to your earlier question, this idea for women of wanting to build relationships with an intention can very often feel like manipulation or extractive or just plain using people. Well, I mean, of course it can be that. And if all your relationships are one way, take, 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 well, then that is what they are. But some of them can be just that. And there's simply nothing wrong with it. And so really it's about those four things and getting, like I say, intentional and deliberate around them.
What do you think of how you tell a story around politics? And one reason I'm asking that question is, at Gagen MacDonald, we believe there are really three things that change everything. When you boil it all down, you need a really compelling story, you need committed leaders, and an intentional roadmap. It seems to me that how one tells oneself and others a story around politics is a big part of that success and the transformation.
100%. And so I say to people often in lectures or workshops or whatever, look, let's just start with what the definition of politics is. And it's the range of informal and official activities that happen in all organizations around power, relationships, influence, and reputation and getting things done. So that's the actual definition. But I totally understand that if, for multiple reasons, your perceptions around office politics are so ingrained and so viscerally negative that no matter what I say, you can't get over this aversion to them, well, then that's fine. You're not here to pass an exam. You're here to become more effective in ways that you want to be. So call these things anything you want. Tell yourself the story, give them the naming convention that will give you a sense of energy and possibility around these things, rather than, I've got to grit my teeth and go play politics. Yes, good politics, but I feel like it's like a hole in the head. No, what is this about? What can it be about? Not just for you, but for your stakeholders that are counting on you. And I always emphasize this. This is about what people need from you, and that's your team and your stakeholders. This is not just about you. I had a delegate in a workshop the other day say she's working for somebody that she thinks is fabulous. But this fabulous person, technically very smart, refuses to work the informal channels, refuses to play politics of whatever kind. And she said, so I'm actually now at a point where I'm having to leave her team because we need her to play those channels. We need her to engage in those conversations for us to get things done and to be more effective. But she's not having the meetings before the meeting. She's not picking up the phone. She's playing it strictly by the formal book as opposed to the informal book as well. And so, as I say, this is not just about you. And therefore, think about the risks and the implications and the opportunity costs for you and for everyone else if you don't get this right. And then call it whatever you want. Building stakeholder relationships, getting more effective in the informal space, whatever it is that galvanizes you and gets your interest and attention and energy. And then go forth and conquer.
Do you feel that there are other things that leaders at all levels contribute to, both positively and negatively, in terms of politics?
Always. I mean, one of the things that I live by is that leaders get what they demonstrate and what they tolerate. And so what are you demonstrating in terms of how you are engaging in politics, in a constructive way, in a destructive way, in a way that serves everyone or serves just yourself? And what are you tolerating in terms of how other people are doing it around you? I mean, that sets the tone. And it doesn't take a rocket science to connect the dots back from the culture you have to what you're demonstrating and tolerating. Of course, leadership is not everything, but leadership is significant in the shadow that it casts. And that shadow extends all through an organization, and it happens at every level of the organization. And frankly, in my experience, it continues sometimes long after the leaders have left the organization. I mean, I've been in companies sometimes and I thought, where's this coming from? And when you dig a bit deeper, and I'm sure you've had the
Yeah.
same experience, I think
Right.
the person's not even here anymore. Oh, you know what? The person's not even alive anymore. And yet their shadow is still being felt, and the behavior is still being modeled in the way that they modeled it. It's just become how we do things around here, even without that person casting the shadow anymore.
So you were just talking about the importance of really playing politics and in a healthy way. What are some of the political mistakes you should avoid?
Gosh, where do we start? I think it was Einstein who was asked, what's the difference between genius and stupidity? And he answered, well, genius has its limits. So I think when it comes to making political mistakes and committing political suicide, gosh, I mean, where do we start and where do we finish? I think maybe the few that I've seen played out the most often and that are the most important to think about are what Marie McIntyre, who wrote a fabulous book on office politics as well, talks about, where she says, when you become the problem, in capital letters. So, and she goes on to say that when you become the problem, a marked shift in thinking happens in your manager. And instead of trying to think about how to coach you and support you, they start to fantasize about how much easier their life would be if you were gone, and wonder how many last chances they're going to give you before the axe actually falls. And so I always say to people, look, organizations are not democracies, they're power structures. Of course, you matter, and what you're trying to achieve in your life and your career matters. And if it doesn't, well, then potentially you're running the risk of becoming a martyr. So, yes, you matter. But when things happen and they change, you need to either accept it and get on with it, or make some alternative plans. And I have a colleague now who's in exactly that position. Very senior executive in a company, been there for 20 years, has a great track record, but the CEO has changed, strategy has changed. She doesn't agree with it, and she will not stop telling anybody who will listen, and I suspect a few people who won't, how much she doesn't agree with it. And I said to her, "This is giving me alarm bells. I mean, I'm just seeing red flashing lights all over your head as you tell me the story." I said, "Because in my opinion, it's a very limited amount of time before that CEO starts to fantasize how much easier his life would be before you were gone. Things have changed. Like it or lump it. Get on with it or get out of there." I think the second thing is to get on the wrong side of your boss. If you don't trust your boss, you need to find another boss, but you need to also understand that if your boss doesn't trust you, you're probably going to have to find another job in pronto. And I think the third one, it's so obvious, I can't believe I have to say it, but I have to say it, is publicly criticizing your company, especially in a world of social media and where Google doesn't forget. I had a story told to me just a few weeks ago of a senior manager who was in a strategy session around a new customer strategy and went onto Facebook, of all things, to complain to her whole audience that she can't believe that she's in customer service strategy. Everyone knows that this organization, and she mentioned the organization's name, doesn't care about its customers.
Oh my gosh.
You know, really, sweetheart, Facebook didn't make you stupid. It just gave you the opportunity to show how stupid and how badly you lack judgment to the whole world. So surprise, surprise, she was out of a job in a few days. So I think those are probably some of the most egregious ones that immediately come to
Yeah.
mind.
Yeah, those are good ones. What are you seeing now with the whole remote and hybrid work in terms of how that's affecting office politics?
Interestingly, I think a lot of people, and it makes sense at first glance, thought that, oh, well, isn't it going to be wonderful? We don't have to go into the office, so we don't have to deal with office politics. Well, this is not so bad after all. But actually, my experience, all the research that I'm reading says that that's not the case at all. The form of politics may have changed. So it's not the creative collisions at the water cooler. It's not the physical engagements at the coffee shop or after the meeting, staying behind to chat. The form may have changed, but the need for it has not. And it really builds on what Carla Harris said so beautifully in her TED talk. Some of the most important decisions of your career are going to be made when you are not in the room. And so, who is in that room for you and what are they saying? Now that's a truth, whether that room is virtual or real. And those important decisions are still being made, even though people are dispersed and scattered. Those decisions around promotions, around secondments, around bonuses, around retrenchments. Those things happen. Who you have in that room for you, what they're saying for you, what they're saying about you, that's much more a function of your political capital than it is of your technical skill.
I'm wondering too if coaching isn't really being affected by being remote, because one thing I've noticed is it used to be if you were in a meeting and something came up where I would have just an opportunity to coach someone, I could grab them right after the meeting, pull them aside quickly, just say, "Hey, I just ought to flag this." Now you have to schedule a call. So it's way more dramatic to coach somebody than it was in the past.
That's a great point. I've never actually thought about it, but you're, of course, absolutely right. Yeah.
So I was thinking in the context of the work you're doing, then what should one do to make sure you're being coached and give yourself that opportunity so that it's just not lost in the day to day, like back to back to back Zoom calls.
So I love the fact that you even use the metaphor of coach. I wrote an article the other day saying how it seems to me repeatedly that one of the biggest stumbling blocks in people's development is honest, timely feedback. And how many people, no matter how senior, either lack the will or the skill or the courage, frankly, to just coach people. And so, again, back to your point, if you frame it as coaching, maybe people would be more willing to give it and people would be more willing to take it. Because I said, it's analogous to a tennis coach coming to their player at the end of Wimbledon and saying, or at the end of a season and saying, gosh, you really could have won Wimbledon if you'd just done this, that, and the next thing. Well, thanks. That was 6 months ago. Why didn't you tell me then? And it's ludicrous, of course, but the premise of a coach is that they're on your side. They want to see you win and they're going to tell you all that they can to help you. Whereas the premise, spoken or unspoken, experienced or perceived so many times with managers, is they're out to catch me or they're out to punish me. Now, that may be the case, but if your intention is to coach and my intention is to be coached, well, doesn't that change everything in terms of possibilities? And so I suppose that then opens up the obligation on both people's sides to recognize the potential in this and to make time for it, to actually ask, is there anything you want to give me feedback on, coach me on in terms of how I showed up? And then similarly, having taken the step to ask the question, be open to what you're going to get told and hope like crazy that people care enough about you to actually give the honest feedback. Because that was one of the things I learned so many years ago in such incredibly valuable feedback training, giving and receiving feedback, that actually we only summon up the courage and the energy, because it takes both, to give negative feedback when we care enough about the person to bother. And I mean, I've seen that in myself. When I don't give negative feedback, maybe once or twice it's courage. Most times it's I don't give a damn enough. And then of course that starts me asking, why not? What's going on here?
I remember someone once taught me that there's a big difference between being nice and being kind.
Oh,
And being
absolutely.
nice is not kind in many cases. Yeah, so that's always been a good learning for me.
I so violently agree. When people tell me that they have a nice culture, actually alarm bells go off for me. And I say, very seldom are nice cultures nice. There is inevitably a lot more going on under the surface that's anything but nice in ostensibly nice cultures.
So, as we're talking about how difficult coaching can be during a remote or hybrid environment, I'm wondering, what do you think leaders could actually be doing in a better way to further drive a coaching environment?
So I think there's a number of things we probably all need to think about. And the one mantra for me always is control the controllables. So I always say I don't get stressed about the things that couldn't have been avoided, couldn't have been prevented, but I get very annoyed and very stressed about the things that could have been avoided and should have been avoided. I think when it comes to a sustained, engaged way of showing up as a leader and as a human being, I remember once speaking to a very senior leader, and I was there coming in as part of a strategic change initiative, and he looked at me and he said, I've been here for so many years. I've seen it all. I've heard it all. I'm so cynical. And, I don't know where these words came from because I'd never consciously formulated them. But as I looked at him, I said to him, in my experience, most cynics are just disillusioned idealists. And as I said this, the tears sprang to this man's eyes. And I thought, wow, I've hit a nerve completely unintentionally. And I think all of us have to find that way to control the controllables and to find that middle ground between being this proud cynic who's actually a disillusioned idealist, but similarly, this raving, rampant, naive idealist that really is not going to get much done. Somewhere in the middle, you've got a degree of pragmatism that allows you to acknowledge what is the operating reality of the world as it is and how you're going to be most effective in it, how you're going to create those islands of sanity and combine power and love. I mean, Martin Luther King said it, I think, very well. He said, power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. You need both. And neither a cynic nor an idealist is going to have both, but a pragmatist and a clear eyed pragmatist could.
So we just have a few more minutes, and of course, I have to ask an important question relative to what we really focus on in this podcast. What do you think leaders most need to let go of?
This metaphor that I've always loved is this idea of a leader as a gardener. I'm looking at my garden now. I mean, I don't make those hydrangeas grow. Well, I mean, it's winter in South Africa, nothing's growing. I don't make them grow. I create the conditions in which they can grow. And I know that my hydrangeas are different to my aerium lilies, are different to my strelitzias, and that not all of them want or need the same thing. And that if I see something coming in that's toxic, I need to get it out. And those weeds, if I don't take care of them very quickly, are going to strangle and overtake everything. But if I create the necessary conditions, if I set the limits and the consequences, I give the support, I give the nurturing, I give everything that's necessary, but not necessarily sufficient for the different types of plants, they will grow, they will figure it out. And I think for me, getting to grips with it and realizing that I'm not abdicating responsibility by doing that, but I am redefining my responsibility as that creator of conditions in which competent, capable, committed people can fully thrive and figure things out with me and for me and beyond me. I mean, not only is that a massive relief, but it's an enabler that I think goes way beyond when I've gotten it right, way beyond what I and my team ever thought was possible, both for them individually and for us collectively, in a nutshell.
Well, that was a hell of a nutshell. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was a bit of a tortured metaphor at times, but okay.
I loved the way you laid it out. And Niven, I just have to tell you, this has been a fantastic conversation. I want to thank you so much for participating in Let Go and Lead and look forward to future conversations. We have a lot to talk about.
Lovely. I do too. So hopefully it's in person over a bottle of good South African wine.
Niven's impressive life journey spans multiple organizations and sectors globally. Her research and now executive coaching on office politics is extensive. Let's recap a few learnings. Office politics are all around us, but most people try to avoid them. Niven shared 4 building blocks that define success. These include your formal power, your influence, which is the informal power that you have and that you can extend, the strategic relationships in which you invest time and you nurture, and lastly, your reputation. In other words, what you are known for and what people think of you. Another key learning is the fundamental difference between controls and control. Controls, such as policies and systems, are critical in high-performing and high-risk organizations because there are a lot of things at stake. But controls are not the same as control. When leaders try to exert too much control over their people's actions and behaviors, this leads to learned helplessness and people checking out. Finally, leaders get what they demonstrate and what they tolerate. What leaders demonstrate in a constructive way serves everyone. However, in a destructive mode, it only serves themselves. And what leaders tolerate in terms of how others are engaging around them sets the tone for the entire company. While leadership isn't everything, it is significant in terms of the shadow it casts and how that leadership's shadow extends throughout the organization. I really valued Niven sharing her expertise in this Let Go and Lead episode. Thank you for joining us.